Welcome to our Science of Canning segment titled Recipe Development. I'm Jessica, home canning expert.
And I'm Brandon, lab expert.
So today I'm going to rely on Brandon quite a bit because I know that we always say follow a recipe that adheres to USDA guidelines, and always saying, hey, every recipe in the Ball Blue Book or on freshpreserving.com has been thoroughly tested to adhere to those guidelines. And I always feel confident knowing that when I share this with folks that they're going to be preserving things that are safe for home food preservation. What I don't really know a lot about is what goes on in the back end when you're developing these recipes, and I know you've been working on this quite a bit, so maybe you could walk us through this process.
We spend a great deal of time in the lab looking at what the recipe entails, for what ingredients go in, what the pH will be, and judging whether it needs to be a water bath process or a pressure canner process. So we spend a great deal of time looking at this to make sure that the food is going to be preserved and safe and also taste great, because we don't want to overdo it and you get something that tastes not so good, but we don't want to underdo it and send somebody to the hospital.
Yes.
And so we spend a great deal of time looking at how the heat from the water bath, the hot water, the boiling water, penetrates the food in the jar. Now, if you have something thick like apple butter, it's going to be heated through what we call conduction. So that's like molecule to molecule. Heat moves this way into the jar to the center point, and we call that the geocenter of the jar. Now, if it's something like salsa, tomato juice, that would be convection. And you see boiling water in a pot. Right. It kind of swirls around like this. Well, that's what happens in the jar. So we're looking at the cold spots in the jar. Like, how long does it take to heat up the coldest spot in the jar? So apple butter, that would be the very center.
Right.
And something with juice would be the bottom, down here on the bottom of the jar. Because hot water is going to rise and swirl around in here. So this will always be the coldest spot of the jar.
Okay.
Kind of goes against, what you would think.
You would always think it'd be the center.
Right. But it actually depends on what type of food you're putting in there and the consistency. So we look at the thickness, like the viscosity of the food. It has a lot of sugar in it. That's going to make it thicker.
Right.
If it's something like a salsa and large chunks of food, might be conduction. So we got to figure that out. So we have these data loggers, and we can position these. If I put this one in, it's going to be in the geocenter. So that'll be able to read the temperature in the center of the jar over the course of the process. And the one in the bottom here will actually record the temperature if it's a convection process.
Okay.
So it's a pretty nifty little thing that we can do. And they do this in like industrial canneries too. They do the exact same thing. They'll put them in cans and they'll run them through their process and see how things heat in the cans or in the jars.
Right.
So we are able to, over the course of time, chart the temperature in the jar. And what's really interesting is you'll see the water bath temperature here. So this is 212 degrees, kind of oscillating back and forth here. And then this is the temperature actually inside the jar over the course of time. So we see, here's the water heating up, and it's 212 degrees up here. And down here we have the initial temperature of the food.
Right.
So as the temperature increases, of course the temperature up here is always the same, but the heat, it's gaining heat inside the jar. But what's interesting is at this point, the recipe calls for taking the food out. Say it's a 30-minute process. So after 30 minutes, do your 5-minute wait in your water bath, and you pull your jars out and set them on the countertop. Well, it's interesting that you still see the heat moving to the cold spot of the jar. That could be, the center or the bottom, depending on the recipe.
Because it's essentially still cooking. Because I know a lot of folks take it out and they're like, oh, it's still boiling and stuff.
Exactly.
So that's what's actually happening right there.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that heat is still driving to the cold spot of that jar. And so it's really interesting, that you see that, and most people may not think about that. So it's important to follow the recipes to the exact letter, because we've designed them for that very specific reason, for food safety and to inactivate or kill off the pathogens in the jar to keep people healthy and to prevent the food from spoiling.
Right, and that's essentially why you're processing, is it kills
Exactly.
all of those things, and sometimes you forget that that's what you're really doing when you're going through the canning process. So that's really cool that you can see that in every recipe that you're developing, and that also just makes me feel so much more confident to know that this kind of work is going on the backside to make sure that anything that we're publishing and sharing with you is going to be safe for home food preservation. And as Brandon mentioned, they're doing it with pressure canning and water bath canning, and I think that's great. So I really do appreciate this, and I hopefully all of you who are tuning in really enjoyed this segment of Science of Canning with Recipe Development. Have a great day.
See you later.